David Holtzclaw had no reason to linger that fateful day when he'd stopped by Blue Ridge Savings Bank just after 1 o'clock on the afternoon of May 16th, 2003. He was dropping off some Arby's sandwiches for his mother, Sylvia, a bank teller who was the lone employee on duty. They chatted for a few minutes, said goodbye, and David left. Less than half an hour later, 3 people inside that bank would be dead, and David would never speak to his mother again. What happened in the intervening minutes remains, more than 2 decades later, one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in South Carolina history. Blue Ridge Savings Bank wasn't what most people picture when they hear the word bank. It was an Asheville-based institution that had expanded into South Carolina's upstate region in 2002, opening several branches in search of a more stable economy. The Greer branch sat in a single-wide mobile home on East Frontage Road, a dead-end stretch overlooking Interstate 85 near the Highway 14 exit. Unsurprisingly, there was no imposing marble lobby, nor was there a security guard at the door. It was a modest trailer, isolated and exposed, with one employee working inside on any given shift. That employee, on the afternoon in question, was 56-year-old Sylvia Holtzclaw. Born and raised in Greer, Sylvia was a fixture of her community. She'd married her high school sweetheart and raised 2 sons as a single mother after their divorce. She was a regular at Greer First Baptist Church and had helped organize a yearly Christmas toy drive for children in need. Sylvia was exactly the kind of person who'd stay late when a coworker called in sick, which is precisely what happened that fateful Friday. She was supposed to be done by lunchtime, but her backup couldn't make it in, and Sylvia agreed to cover the full shift alone. The timeline that investigators later assembled is chillingly precise. At approximately 1 p.m., David Holtzclaw arrived at the bank with lunch and spent a few minutes with his mother. He left around 1:10. At 1:24 p.m., a surveillance camera at a gas station down the road captured a red coupe, later identified as most likely an Oldsmobile Alero, driving toward the bank. 4 minutes later, at roughly 1:28, a man armed with a Glock entered and confronted Sylvia at gunpoint. Seconds into this confrontation, the situation escalated in the worst possible way. Dr. James Barnes, a 61-year-old physics professor at the University of South Carolina, Spartanburg, walked into the bank with his wife, Margaret Barnes, aged 58. The couple, married for 38 years since meeting as college sweethearts at King University, had come to do a routine money transfer. Dr. Barnes was nearing retirement after 28 years at the university, where he'd served twice as interim dean. Maggie worked as a convention coordinator for the National Beta Club, an academic honor society. Unfortunately for this couple, they walked straight into an armed robbery in progress. The robber now had 3 hostages. At 1:30 p.m., Sylvia managed to trip the bank's silent alarm, a mechanism built into the cash drawer designed to alert police. What happened in the minutes between the alarm and police arrival is where the case becomes deeply disturbing and frustratingly mysterious. Officers from the Greer Police Department arrived at approximately 1:41 p.m., roughly 11 minutes after the alarm was triggered. From the outside, nothing appeared obviously wrong, but inside, the bank was empty. The cash drawer had been cleared out, though the amount taken was relatively small and consisted entirely of unmarked bills. The cops didn't notice any signs of struggle and proceeded to attempt to secure the small banking facility. As officers moved down the back hallway, they entered a utility room and found all 3 victims: Sylvia Holtzclaw, Dr. James Barnes, and Maggie Barnes. Tragically, they had all been shot to death with a .40 caliber Glock. Perhaps most disturbingly of all, there was no sign of a struggle, and they appeared to have been herded into the back room, where this senseless act of cruelty took place. The gas station camera that captured the red car heading toward the bank at 1:24 p.m. also recorded it speeding away at approximately 1:33 p.m. The entire crime, from entry to exit, had unfolded in roughly 9 minutes. Adding to the investigative nightmare, the bank's own VHS security tape, which should have recorded everything inside, was missing. Further investigation would reveal that the robber took the tape, with some speculating that he had ordered Holtzclaw to remove it before eliminating the witnesses. The investigation that followed was massive. The Greer Police Department partnered with the Greenville and Spartanburg County Sheriff's Offices, the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, and the FBI. Over the years, investigators followed up on more than 2,000 tips, and the Bureau offered a $100,000 reward. Composite sketches were released of a man seen at the bank shortly before the robbery, described as a white male, between 5'6" and 5'8" tall. He was described as moderately obese, between 50 and 55 years old, with short blonde hair showing touches of gray and a general clean-cut appearance. Every lead, for years, went nowhere, likely because this man wasn't ever even confirmed to be a suspect. Police eventually looked into Lennell Ditches, a former janitor responsible for 17 bank robberies across South Carolina between 2000 and 2006. But he had a strong alibi, and crucially, nobody had ever been harmed in any of his robberies. That's not to say he wasn't violent, and after all, he was robbing banks. But for him, his eyes were on the loot, not on committing something that could get him a visit to the chair. He was eventually cleared and ultimately spent 15 years in prison for the bank robberies. The strongest lead came in the summer of 2005, when investigators identified a man named Emerson Wright as a person of interest. Wright, a convicted felon from Beach Island, South Carolina, who also went by the names Ernest Wright and Akeem Johnson, had an extensive criminal record. He had convictions in Georgia and South Carolina, including convictions for aggravated assault on police, burglary, and receiving stolen property. Most critically, on May 1, 2003, just 15 days before the slayings, Wright had used his sister's vehicle to crash through a fence at an Avis rental lot near the bank. From there, he proceeded to steal a red Oldsmobile Alero, the same type of car seen on surveillance footage. To make matters worse, his weapon of choice across multiple robberies in Georgia was a .40 caliber Glock, the same type used during the robbery. The circumstantial evidence was compelling, but investigators couldn't place Wright in Greer. There were no receipts, no addresses, no physical evidence tying him to the area beyond the stolen car. They needed to talk to him, but they never got the chance, since the saga of Emerson Wright was about to take a very bizarre turn. In October 2004, Wright was spotted during a police checkpoint in Georgia and fled. He led officers on a high-speed chase before crashing and eventually successfully escaping on foot. Then, on August 2, 2005, Georgia State Patrol pulled Wright over in Eatonton, but this time, the fugitive did something rather bizarre. He stepped out of the stolen vehicle, and rather than fighting or attempting to run, he pulled out the Glock he was packing and pulled the curtains on himself. Whatever he might have known about the Blue Ridge Savings Bank robbery perished with him. Notably, his Glock was eventually tested, but investigators eliminated it as the specific weapon used during the robbery. Of course, this doesn't actually eliminate him as a suspect, but it does make it less likely that he was the person involved. Also, unlike the possible suspect seen at the bank just before the robbery, Emerson was black, while the potential suspect was white. Investigators now generally believe that Emerson wasn't involved in the crime, though his disturbing final act suggests to some that he may have been. In November 2016, the case took a strange and unexpected new turn involving a serial predator. Todd Kohlhepp, a successful real estate agent from Moore, South Carolina, was arrested after police rescued a woman named Kayla Brown. She'd been chained inside a shipping container on his property for 2 months. Under interrogation, the police ended up getting more than they bargained for. Kohlhepp confessed to the quadruple slaying at Superbike Motorsports in Chesney, South Carolina, on November 6, 2003. This shooting had occurred less than 6 months after the Blue Ridge robbery, and it was only 30 miles away. The Greer Police Department naturally immediately took notice and wanted further information. There were unsettling similarities between the two crimes, starting with the fact that both involved execution-style shots at somewhat isolated commercial locations. Both attacks also happened in broad daylight with no surviving witnesses, and both offered easy escape routes with minimal chance of detection. Kohlhepp had also previously been a student at the same university where Dr. Barnes taught physics, with some believing there could have been tension between the two men. However, no concrete proof that the two knew of each other or interacted was ever established. When he was questioned about Blue Ridge, he denied any responsibility for what happened, despite claiming responsibility for 7 confirmed slayings over the course of decades. Personally, I think he looks a lot like the forensic sketch that was released, and Kohlhepp is also noticeably obese, much like the potential suspect. However, on the flip side, he was in his early 30s at the time of the attack, far outside the range for the middle-aged man the suspect was described as. Notably, in 2011, someone attempted to rob the Greer branch a second time, unsuccessfully. Later that year, the North Carolina Commissioner of Banks shut down the entire Blue Ridge Savings Bank Corporation, and its assets were transferred to the Bank of North Carolina. The Greer branch closed for good in November of that year, and the little green trailer has sat vacant ever since, rusting along that dead-end frontage road. On October 9, 1979, a Harvard-educated attorney from one of San Diego's wealthiest enclaves was supposed to walk through the doors of a federal prison. Instead, Walter Wenck walked off the face of the earth. He left behind a wife of 30 years, 2 grown children, a tangled empire of looted companies, and a federal conviction for fraud. No confirmed sighting, no arrest, no body, just a blurry photograph on a U.S. Marshals wanted poster and a trail that goes cold somewhere south of the border. It's the longest-running fugitive case in San Diego history, and the man at its center may have pulled off the most successful vanishing act in American white-collar crime. Wenck was born on March 30, 1924. He attended Harvard Law School, spoke multiple languages, and reportedly had some background in intelligence work, though the specifics remain murky. By the 1960s, he'd established himself as a prominent attorney in San Diego, even running as a Democratic candidate for Congress in 1960. He lost that race, but his appetite for influence didn't shrink, not in the least. By the early 1970s, Wenck had shifted his attention to finance, and it was here that his genius for manipulation found its fullest expression. He'd acquire controlling interests in publicly owned companies that were struggling or had minimal real assets. He chose such stellar companies like Time Lenders Inc., Sunfruit Limited, and Santa Fe Financial Corporation to become vehicles for his complex scheme. Once he had control, he'd sell stock in these entities while siphoning off their assets, funneling money through a labyrinth of trusts and corporate shells for his personal benefit. The Securities and Exchange Commission caught on in 1976, and there would be major consequences for this once well-respected lawyer. They filed a massive civil action against Wenck, his wife Catherine, several associates, and more than 25 corporate and trust entities he controlled. The SEC alleged that Wenck had been systematically looting publicly owned companies in violation of federal securities laws. The fraud was enormous, touching investors across the country who'd bought stock in companies being hollowed out from the inside. What made the case more brazen was Wenk's attempt to outmaneuver the federal courts. Before the SEC filed its complaint, he'd petitioned a Nevada court to place Sunfruit, one of the companies he was hollowing out, into receivership. Because Nevada law didn't require a disinterested receiver, Wenk got himself appointed as the receiver of his own company. The Ninth Circuit later found that the state receivership was nothing more than a continuation of the fraud itself, a legal cloak thrown over his ongoing looting. The federal court stripped away that protection, appointed their own receiver, and permanently barred Wenk from securities activity. In April 1978, a federal jury convicted Wenk of mail fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. His appeals were denied, and by October 1979, he'd exhausted his legal options. The court ordered him to surrender on October 9th, believing that he would ultimately simply show up to serve his sentence. But he never showed up, and on the very day he was supposed to surrender, Wenk vanished from his home in Rancho Santa Fe. He left behind his family and everything that tied him to his former life. The disappearance was clean, deliberate, and well-planned. Investigators learned he'd traveled extensively before his conviction, visiting the Bahamas, Mexico, Europe, and South America. He was almost certainly laying the groundwork for exactly this scenario if his appeals failed. The assistant U.S. attorney who prosecuted the case, Tom Coffin, remembered Wenk as exceptionally intelligent but also arrogant and rude. It was a combination that alienated the jury during his legal proceedings, but served him well on the run. Coffin, himself a Harvard Law graduate who owned a dachshund with the same name as Wenk's, found the disappearance almost personally insulting. Investigators suspected Wenk ended up in China, leveraging language skills and intelligence connections to vanish where extradition was impossible. A number of American intelligence agencies eventually had to publicly deny involvement. And of course, as you know, having three-letter agencies come out and publicly say that they weren't involved in something definitely means he wasn't an intelligence asset. After all, there's no one who I would sooner take at their word than representatives of organizations who explicitly deal in deception. Over the decades, the hunt for Wenk ebbed and flowed but never stopped. In February 1989, Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment on his case, generating roughly 120 tips. None led anywhere. In 1991, federal agents launched a major push, interviewing relatives and former associates across the country, but there was still nothing. Sightings were reported from the Caribbean to Mexico to Europe to various parts of Asia. While in most cases this may have indicated a number of false sightings, with Wenk and his shadowy intelligence connections and endless hoard of wealth, these may have been real. The most recent credible lead came in 2011, when U.S. Marshals followed a tip to Taxco, a silver mining town in the Mexican state of Guerrero. The fugitive wasn't there, though there was some indication to suggest that he had been there at one time in the past. Ultimately, though, that's where the trail ends, and no more sightings have been reported in the years since. Meanwhile, the financial wreckage took over 2 decades to sort through. One single attorney, Alex Harper, spent the better part of his career unraveling the case's tangled aftermath, tracing looted assets, and pursuing disgorgement proceedings through the courts. Interestingly, when Harper died in 2020, his family's published obituary mentioned the case and how the fugitive's escape had haunted him into retirement. In all likelihood, what finally caught up with Wenk wasn't justice, but the unceasing march of Father Time. Whatever the case, though, Walter White effectively got away with one of the most massive frauds in American history, perhaps with a little help from his friends in intelligence. On the afternoon of December 4th, 2008, a man pulled into a gas station along Autoroute 440 in Laval, Quebec, to fill up his pale gray Nissan. It was the kind of mundane errand that thousands of people run every day without a second thought. But Mario Marabella wasn't like most people, and this wasn't going to be a normal stop. Within moments, 3 or 4 men descended on him, forced him into a waiting minivan, and sped off into the cold December afternoon. That evening, Marabella's Nissan was found engulfed in flames at Guam Boulevard and Lambert Street in East End, Montreal. By the time it was found, it was virtually completely destroyed, along with any evidence it may have held. Mario Marabella, known to the mafia underworld as Skinny, was never seen again. His disappearance didn't make international headlines, and for anyone outside Montreal's underworld, the name barely registered. But within organized crime circles in Quebec, his abduction sent a very specific message, one that reverberated for years, triggering retaliatory violence that would leave multiple men dead. Marabella inhabited a world of loan sharks, drug traffickers, and the most powerful mafia family in Canadian history. The Marabella name carried a strange duality in Montreal. On one side, there was Tony Marabella, born in the early 1970s in the borough of St. Leonard. Tony was a baseball prospect and a legitimate one at that. He signed with the Montreal Expos as an undrafted free agent at 16 and spent 8 professional seasons grinding through the minors. Along the way, he suffered a bizarre health scare during batting practice, collapsing with sudden amnesia that landed him on a 1996 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. Despite that brush with fame, Tony never cracked the majors, topping out at Double-A Harrisburg before drifting into independent ball and then retiring. Mario, on the other hand, took a very different route, and he became deeply entangled in the criminal underworld of Montreal's Italian community. He accumulated convictions for loan sharking, extortion, and breaking probation. In 1992, he and Giuseppe DeVito robbed a liquor truck, an escapade that earned Marabella a guilty plea for possessing stolen goods and a 90-day sentence. By the mid-2000s, he was also reportedly involved in trafficking massive quantities of weed as well. None of this was small-time freelancing. Mario Marabella was a soldier, a recognized member of the Rizzuto crime family, the most powerful organized crime syndicate in Canada. To understand why Marabella's kidnapping mattered, we need to grasp the state of the Rizzuto organization in late 2008. The family, led for decades by patriarch Niccolo Rizzuto and his son Vito, had built an empire stretching across Quebec and Ontario. They also had international connections reaching into New York, Venezuela, and certain parts of Italy, mainly Sicily. They controlled drug importation, loan sharking, illegal gambling, and construction rackets. American law enforcement considered them a faction of New York's Bonanno crime family, though Canadian authorities recognized them as independent. They have occasionally been dubbed the Sixth Family, as their power rivaled any of the 5 families of New York. But by 2008, that empire was crumbling, and in January 2004, Vito Rizzuto had been arrested on racketeering charges connected to the 1981 slayings of 3 Bonanno captains in New York. After years fighting extradition, he was sent to the United States in 2006 and ultimately sentenced to 10 years. With the boss in an American prison, the family's grip on the underworld began to weaken. Then came Operation Colisée. In November 2006, more than 700 police officers executed the largest organized crime sweep in Canadian history. They arrested 90 individuals, including Niccolo Rizzuto, along with key lieutenants. In the vacuum that followed, a power struggle erupted. Agostino Contrera, a senior member of the allied Contrera-Caruana Mafia clan, was tapped as the successor to lead the Montreal Mafia, and Mario Marabella, known on the street as Skinny, answered directly to Contrera. He was, by many accounts, Contrera's right-hand man. The grab was swift and coldly professional. On the afternoon of December 4th, Marabella stopped at a service station in Laval's Val-de-Brise district, just off Autoroute 440. Several men converged on him, overpowered him, and shoved him into a minivan. The vehicle then drove off at high speed. There was no prolonged struggle, no dramatic standoff, and it was over in moments, with some people in the vicinity seeing nothing at all. And this was before the wall of silence went up from ordinary people who didn't want to get themselves entangled in mafia affairs. Later that evening, police located Marabella's Nissan burning in Montreal's East End. The torching of the car was a deliberate act of evidence destruction, but it was also a statement. In organized crime, burning a victim's vehicle signals that the person isn't coming back. Police developed several theories about why Marabella was targeted. The prevailing explanation was that Marabella had accumulated significant debts and had been drawing too much attention to himself. In the mafia, maintaining a low profile is a survival requirement for most members, with flashy members like John Gotti being notable exceptions rather than the rule. Excessive visibility attracts public attention from the general public, which leads to police scrutiny, and scrutiny is bad for everyone's business. But there was a deeper dimension. Given Marabella's position as Contrera's right-hand man, his abduction was also interpreted as an attack on Contrera's authority. By extension, this was also an assault on whatever remained of the Rizzuto power structure, and somebody was sending a message that the old guard was no longer untouchable. Mario Marabella's body has never been found, and while he could technically still be alive, nobody seriously believes that. Quebec's cold case unit lists him as almost certainly deceased, and investigators have long assumed that he was eliminated shortly after being taken. His case remains officially unsolved, but the story doesn't end with his disappearance. In the months and years that followed, the Rizzuto organization continued to hemorrhage. In June 2010, Agostino Contrera himself, the man Marabella had served, was shot down with his bodyguard outside his totally legitimate place of business in Montreal. Then in November 2010, a sniper's bullet struck 86-year-old Niccolo Rizzuto through his own kitchen window, pulling the curtains on this once powerful mafia kingpin. When Vito Rizzuto was finally released from prison in 2012, the retaliation was immediate. Within a single month of his return to Montreal, several men connected to the campaign against his family turned up dead. In fact, 3 men who were implicated in another kidnapping of a Rizzuto ally were all found dead under mysterious circumstances. Some sources have connected their slayings directly to the Marabella kidnapping, but given the secrecy around these sort of events, nothing was publicly confirmed. The message was unmistakable. The Rizzutos had long memories, and debts would be repaid in kind. Mario Marabella's case occupies an uncomfortable space in the history of organized crime. He wasn't an innocent bystander. He was a man with a criminal record, a soldier in a mafia family, someone who'd spent years operating in a world where violence was a routine cost of doing business. That context doesn't make his disappearance any less disturbing or chilling. In fact, perhaps it makes it more so, because it reveals just how disposable even connected men can become when the tides of power shift in the brutal arena of the criminal underworld. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons and to click the share button and send this video to your friends and family. Also, don't forget to consider checking out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to help out my channel further. You can also check out my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, on Spotify, so make sure to give me a listen and a follow over there as well. Bladenboro, North Carolina, is the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and nothing much ever happens. Nestled among pine forests and swampland at the southeastern edge of the Piedmont, the town had barely a few hundred residents in the early 1950s. But in the winter of 1953 and into January of 1954, something started eating farm animals in and around this usually quiet town. It did so in a manner so savage that this quiet community became the epicenter of one of the strangest monster scares in American history. The trouble began on December 29, 1953, in the nearby town of Clarkton, about 8 miles away. A woman heard her neighbor's dogs barking frantically, then falling silent. When she went outside, she spotted a large, dark, cat-like creature slinking into the night. 2 days later, on New Year's Eve, Police Chief Roy Forays was called to the farm of a resident named Johnny Voss. 2 of his dogs had been eliminated overnight by some sort of bizarre and unseen force. Their bodies were mangled, skulls crushed, and blood pooled across the porch. On New Year's Day, 1954, 2 more dogs turned up dead on Woody Storm's farm. And normally, I wouldn't have mentioned the name of this guy, but I couldn't resist the power of the name Woody Storm. The 2 dogs' bodies showed the same hallmarks as previously, and there was a near-total absence of blood. An autopsy on one of the canine victims reportedly confirmed the animal had been drained, a detail that earned the predator a chilling nickname in the press, the Vampire Beast. Eyewitness descriptions varied but painted a broadly consistent picture. Most people described something feline, dark in color, with a long tail and a face resembling a panther. Estimates placed it at 4 to 5 feet long and about 20 inches high, weighing between 80 and 150 pounds. A few witnesses claimed they'd seen a smaller animal, or a group of them, traveling alongside it, suggesting this creature was feeding its offspring. Multiple residents described hearing a cry that sounded like a woman screaming, a noise that made even hunting dogs cower. Then just like that, the beast apparently turned its attention toward a person. On the evening of January 5th, 1954, a 21-year-old mother named Mrs. Kinlaw was outside her home a few miles from town. She heard dogs whimpering and went to her porch. There, she saw a large cat-like creature moving toward her, and she screamed and bolted inside. Her husband grabbed his shotgun and rushed out, but the animal had vanished, leaving only large paw prints in the dirt. The encounter ran on the front page of the Raleigh News and Observer, and the story went from local curiosity to regional sensation. The coverage ignited a frenzy, and hunters from across the Carolinas and as far as Tennessee descended on Bladenboro. Professional trackers from Wilmington brought trained hound dogs. Fraternity brothers from UNC Chapel Hill showed up armed and looking for a trophy for their frat house. By January 5th, over 500 people were tramping through the woods, looking to get a shot at this unknown cat beast. The following night, that number passed 800. By January 7th, nearly 1,000 hunters had gathered. The town was overwhelmed with armed strangers, reporters, and curiosity seekers, and the spectacle of the beast was getting to be more disturbing than the animal itself. At the center of the chaos stood Mayor Woodrow Fussell, who also owned Bladenboro's movie theater. It was Fussell who'd called the Wilmington newspapers about the dead dogs, and he later told the Carolina Farmer magazine that a little publicity never hurt a small town. During the panic, he traveled to Charlotte to book a film called The Big Cat for his theater, advertising that audiences could now see the cat on screen and in Technicolor. A local sign painter began producing souvenir bumper plates proclaiming Bladenboro as the beast's home. The line between genuine terror and carnival spectacle was getting thinner by the day, a fact that upset many of the residents. By mid-January, the situation had become dangerous. The town was armed to the teeth with various posses from across the region seeking the creature. Police Chief Flores and Mayor Fussell recognized someone was going to get shot, given the general lawlessness and tomfoolery that had taken hold. Many of the hunters, being unable to find their quarry, took to drinking and socializing, all while maintaining their arsenals. Controversially, one group of hunters had announced their plan to adopt a shelter dog for the sole purpose of using it as bait for the cat beast. This sparked regional outrage, and combined with the growing tensions in the town, Fussell begrudgingly told the hunters to go home. On January 13th, a farmer named Luther Davis found a bobcat in a steel trap in Big Swamp, about 4 miles from town, and shot it. The mayor declared the beast of Bladenboro found and eliminated, and the dead cat was strung up on a flagpole in the center of town, beneath a sign announcing its identity. Few people believed it. Skeptics pointed out that an ordinary bobcat couldn't have inflicted such damage. That same day, a local man claimed to have struck a much larger cat with his vehicle while leaving Bladenboro. That animal was described as spotted like a leopard, roughly 22 inches high, and weighing up to 90 pounds. He later claimed that he took it home, and for reasons unknown, it was never examined. However, there was no independent confirmation that such a cat ever existed, beyond the much later recollections. Some later even claimed that a local German shepherd had been responsible for the attacks, claiming it was mixed with some form of large hound. The profiteering mayor later admitted he believed the whole affair was roughly 90% imagination and 10% truth. Persistent rumors suggest a group of Bladenboro men deliberately fanned the story, feeding exaggerated details to reporters to see who'd bite. But if that's how it was initially conceived, the story didn't end in 1954. That December, 5 pigs and 3 chickens were found dead on a farm near Robeson Memorial Hospital, with crushed skulls, torn limbs, and no blood. In 2007, 60 goats turned up dead, completely drained of blood in Lexington, and more were slaughtered the same way, 30 miles away in Greensboro. During the same year in Bolivia, North Carolina, a group of large, powerful dogs were partly consumed, despite no apparent sign of struggle. Whatever the truth of the matter, today Bladenboro hosts an annual Beast Fest every October, drawing cryptid enthusiasts with live music, storytelling, and beast-themed merchandise. Whether the creature was a rogue bobcat, an eastern cougar, thought long gone, a feral dog, or something stranger, no one has definitively proven what stalked Bladen County that winter.